Subscribe to our YouTube channel and press the bell icon to get the latest updates.
Vijay, Manu, and Simon, thanks so much for joining me on this panel. And it'll be great to get started with a question first to Vijay. This is really about India and Africa, but we could think about it as being the global south. Now, if we look at where India has contributed greatly to Africa, we really have an excellent example in terms of the antiretrovirals. But if we think about where we are today, what do you think we are contributing, could contribute now in a COVID world? And what do you think is going to happen after this? Vijay, you're on mute.
Yeah, thank you very much, Gagandeep, and it's a pleasure to be here with you, Manu, and Simon. The issue about India and Africa working together is a complex one. And first of all, we need to be clear that there is a lot to learn from each other and not an assumption of what one or the other should do. The reason I bring this up is, at a fundamental level, there is a deep legacy which is imprinted in the world today, that the luxury of fundamental research and understanding comes after a certain level of standard of living is achieved and health and education, primary educational parameters are dealt with. And therefore, countries of the South should primarily focus on these aspects rather than on high-end. India was one of the colonial countries which didn't take that route and had a mix for a variety of reasons. But the fact is that it took that mix. And the result of that is, Indian kids can aspire to be either an astronomer or an engineer or whatever. Some years ago, a delegation of African university vice chancellors came to the Indian Institute of Science, and there was a meeting of directors of all those institutes there. And it was quite shocking to hear colleagues from India taking the view that African countries should first address these fundamental issues and then go on to research. And that's so wrong. And that was, challenged even then. So I think we should see this as a partnership where we get inspired from each other's, centuries of wisdom on one hand, and the opportunities to democratize modern science on the other. And those opportunities exist, and we must push those frontiers in multiple ways. So to give a one-line answer after this preamble is that we must put in place education and training programs of mutual benefit where we get the best of science and technology democratized and accessible to all, no matter where they are, citizens, scholars, students, and so on.
Thanks, Vijay. I think that's a good point to go to Simon, who has considerable experience with thinking about precisely this aspect of not the technologies, but the people. And Simon, it would be really good to hear from you about the work that the Wellcome Trust has been doing in terms of making sure that you shift science, the center of gravity for science, to Africa.
So, Cherry, thanks so much. I just start by saying that if I had $1 for every time we'd said shifting the center of gravity, I would be really rich by now. And I'm really pleased that other people are saying it. So first of all, I just want to say, when you're on a panel like this, you really don't know who's out there. So I wish I could ask people to put up their hands or wave. But honestly, it's a real privilege to be here, invited to this conference and representing Wellcome. So I really do hope that those of you out there in the audience who've braved it for this long will have some challenging questions for us. So let me just take a few minutes, because I'm not going to make the assumption that you all know what Wellcome is. So just forgive me to take a minute or so. So we're a major, if you like, funding foundation of sort of not dissimilar size to the Gates Foundation. We've been around since, well, probably now sort of 80, 90 years. And our mission is to make health better. And we do that predominantly through funding research and through funding sort of health sciences research. A lot of the funding is in the UK, but for 3 to 4 decades, we have funded long-term programs in sub-Saharan Africa. I'm going to come on to India and also in Southeast Asia. And I think it's worth saying, actually, that from a funding perspective, if I put it simply, there's lots of ways of funding, but I'm going to simplify it into 2 for now, which is that you can fund research, which has the promise of either discoveries about life, translational sort of innovative impact. So you're very clear that these are about research impacts, but you can also fund in a way that, let's say, it's more about building capacity, so that your primary outcome is about developing, cadres of well-trained, well-motivated researchers, but who are trained within really excellent research environments. So when I look at Wellcome's portfolio across Africa, India, Southeast Asia, I think we have both. We have long-standing programs in Africa and Southeast Asia, where for 4 decades we've been funding and developing with national partners really sort of world-class outputs. In 2008, and Vijay will know because he was there, Wellcome entered into a partnership with the government of India through DBT, and it's a relationship we're incredibly proud of. And this was really to help develop I guess, and Vijay might correct me, but essentially to help develop a world-class funding scheme for India, and to develop a cadre of really well-trained and of Indian biomedical researchers. So that one, I think, is a bit of both. Great research outputs, but also, building that capacity for India to have a sort of a world-class research workforce. And of course, that's only part of what DBT does and part of what India does. And then in Africa, about 10 years ago, we started very consciously building research capacity. Now, how do we do that? Initially, we were doing that by funding directly into Africa with a very clear remit to build institutions and strengthen individuals. But about 6 years ago, we took this really important decision, and Dr. Kang has already alluded to this when she talks about shifting the center of gravity. So if I can now tell you a bit, I've told you what we do, let me tell you about our principles and what's important. So I think the most important thing is that we're able to adopt, let's call it a very long arm's length. And by arm's length, I don't mean the thousands of miles that separate us, but to avoid that habit where a funder says this is what you should do. So just like we helped set up the Indra Alliance in India, in Africa, we set up a platform. Let's not bother about what it's called. Let's just say it's a funding platform with a partner called the African Academy of Sciences. And our vision was that this would become a funding platform, a funding council for Africa. 5 years later, we are now seeing that organization rolling out a major program, which 5 years ago we would have been managing. And what that means then is that all of those funding decisions are being taken in Africa. And this is a very fundamental change for how most funders operate. What else does that mean? It means that funder's got to be clear about what it gives up. What are you prepared not to control? So giving up is really important. And what kind of risks are you prepared to take by letting go? And the result of that is that we now have probably 1,500 to 2,000 young African researchers coming through. They decide the agenda. They decide what they want to work on. All we ask is that they're trained in high quality environments. Cherry, shall I carry on, or do you want me to pause there? Because I can say more, but I just want to also make sure I'm answering the question and not going too far off course.
Thank you, Simon. I think you've spoken about where you've gotten to in Africa, and perhaps in the next set of questions, I'd like you to at least reflect on what you think the future will look like. Yeah. But I'd like to move to Manu now. and ask him really about, if anybody represents democracy in science, that's you. So can you tell us a little bit about, again, like Simon did, the kind of work that you've done, why you think it's important, and where you'd like to take it? And I think for all of you, the next round of questions, we are really going to focus on the pandemic.
So first of all, thank you so much for having me here. It's incredible to have, policymakers, scientists, and funders and innovators in the same room. It's a virtual room, but it really matters because I think, frankly, I've never had this conversation with this group of people before. So the pandemic forces us to think about this. Personally, for me, I think the philosophy of much of our work that we have done for the last decade almost has really been around this center theme of frugal science, that unless science is directly accessible to all, will it ever have the kind of impact that we care about it having in the society? And I think prior to the pandemic, I used to have these types of conversations. And I think what Vijay brought up was a beautiful analogy to this, where people would think of the value of frugal science as, it has, it might solve certain problems in some faraway places. And I reflected on it in the pandemic, and it occurs often enough that we have a fundamental challenge, no matter where we are around the world, of the value of society deeply engaging in science in the sense of true understanding, for us to build a kind of a pillar where when scientific solutions are available, they're truly absorbed and acted upon, which really did not happen in this pandemic. So for me, the challenge has always been is how to share the kind of work that we do rapidly. We often do much of that by sharing papers and academic insights. But I think as a group, we have really focused on scientific tools. If there was one thing that no matter where I was, I wanted to have access to the tools of discovery. And if these tools of discovery are uniformly accessible, we will have remarkable discoveries, both in fundamental and applied science. And I think there was a shift almost 5 or 6 years ago when we started shipping these tools. One of them that people know about is in the context of microscopy, and now that has expanded quite a lot, of how do you shift the dialogue of ownership? Often enough, the tools that we make are often windows into a world, but we are not asking anybody who wants to participate and collaborate of what they should do with these tools. And they really have to bring their own questions to the table. And when the pandemic hit, it really highlighted for us the importance of making sure that any sets of problems we were going to work on, we work significantly on building and designing open source ICU ventilators, completely open source critical care device, which is a huge endeavor. But we built a team that was based in Kenya, Nepal, a significant portion in India, and 3 universities in the US. And the ownership really belonged amongst this group of 60, 70 innovators all across. And I think it was just a remarkable experience personally for me, because I had been thinking about this for a long while, but for it to happen in such a distributed manner where we can truly bring to life an object that did not exist in a collaborative way, while every single entity locally is thinking about regulatory aspects, taking ownership in their own ecosystem. So I think the pandemic has really forced us to continue this mindset. And my hope sort of is there's no looking back. Post this, I would never work on anything without this framework, because then I don't have to worry about implementation in India, for example, because frankly, I'm not sitting there. What do I know about the shifting sands? And it becomes very important that this transition and translation of much of the work happens really early on at the design stage. So I'm very, in some sense, thankful in how the dialogue has shifted in this context now.
Thank you, Manu. I'd just like to ask the audience that if you have questions, you can put them down in the chat box. And to the speakers, I think I have access to the questions here. You may not be able to see them. So when they come in, I'll direct them to you. So what I'd like to do now is to ask you about the pandemic itself. And for all of you, one of the key things in a pandemic is data, information. We are seeing from the pandemic that Africa and India in some ways are seeing very similar patterns of disease. We are not seeing the incredibly high levels of mortality. In some ways, you could say that we've kind of escaped the worst of it. So learning from each other would obviously be very, very valuable. But you need enablers to do that, and there are significant barriers. So if we start first with Vijay, would you like to reflect on what the opportunities and the challenges really are for sharing of data, both in terms of the data itself as well as approaches to handling the data together?
Thank you very much, Gagandeep. This is the critical issue. Data is of no use unless that is annotated, converted to knowledge, analyzed, and used in decision making. And today's volume of data is such that this analysis is not doable without trained people. Yet there's a fundamental problem here, which is that those who analyze the data have both knowledge and power, and therefore they end up dictating to others who don't have this capacity to analyze data about what is good for them. And indeed, they might be saying actually what is genuinely good. So unless we have a mechanism, and those tools are available today, where the analysis of data and the ability to understand how that analysis was done is available on large scale, if we don't do that, we're not going to see the implementation of the value of the use of data. You're going to see paratroop science in another manner. Earlier, you had paratroop science because of a certain kind of knowledge. Now you will have the data scientists telling you what to do. And that's indeed, that asymmetry is growing. Now, how does one actually solve this issue is the challenge. You cannot have a situation speedily where everyone understands all the tools of data analysis and its interface with microscopes or testing equipment and so on, back and forth. But you can have clusters which understand this in different domains in different ways. And this cluster can be a unit of both understanding of what is happening and protection against exploitation or misdirected ownership of data. And therefore, I think education in data analysis in India, Africa, and countries of the South on scale is very important. And this is feasible today, and that empowers people when they're also connected with domain understanding, whether it is basic science or applied science.
Thank you, Vijay. Manu, would you like to tell us something about, the approaches that you've been taking have really been around being able to answer questions around the causes of disease, so can you tell us a little bit about how you think what the tools are, how integration into data systems is possible? And once again, what do you think application of these across countries could mean for us?
Yeah, I think one of the challenge that Vijay was just highlighting is often enough that in the context of the pandemic, there has been this overwhelming amount of data that's coming from around the world. And how does, as a society, we adopt to really embrace the outcomes that that data might actually be telling us? And sometimes it does tell us we looked at it in the pandemic, I think, since we worked on a very broad set of problems. I'll describe it might seem like a very simple problem, but actually it was probably one of the most trickiest things that we handled. When mask mandates were put in place, and sentences like, oh, you could wear a bandana were starting to come out from the CDC, which we just would not have expected. We started looking at the data that was existent on the quality of different masks. And instead of setting up, because masks are being manufactured around the world, what we truly needed was first the capacity of the instruments that used to measure mask efficiency. And so what we released in an open Google document, which I think, Gagandeep, you alluded to, without just first teaching people how to build this instrument to actually measure mask efficiency. And that instrument got replicated around the world. And we started getting data from people who were starting to go into the markets, actually pick up commercial masks, say in a street in Bangladesh or in Kenya or in a city in the US, and start sending us materials. We started getting materials from around the world. We started getting data from around the world. And I think one of the factors was we were starting to get an understanding of a framework for what types of masks are. I mean, just because it looks like a face covering does not mean it is actually effective. And then eventually, one of the harder challenge, and we are still dealing with this, was really the fact that once we start looking at it, when communities start looking at it, how do we make sure that that cycle of data goes back to the community and the manufacturers? Many of the manufacturers did use the recommendations coming into the materials they were starting to use. But one of the other things that we utilized in this context was starting to engage science communicators in being able to communicate. So there is a group of foldscopers out there that started going to Indian markets, and things that look like a surgical mask is not a surgical mask. And to be really able to do that in a context of not just coming from a scientist, but data originating from other people that you might trust in your own community. Similarly, there was a version of this done by many science communicators on YouTube, really trying to explain why this is so important, that you don't just use a face covering, but you use an effective face covering. So I think, this was, although there is a lot of technical things that we did during the pandemic, this one was a tricky one because I was always at an unease that just because we understand masks doesn't mean it will have any impact. And I still worry about it. Even with the vaccines coming on, we still have to wear masks for another 6 months, I believe. And it is the factor that an effective mask is truly, it's an important aspect, but many a times it gets lost in the chaos of how, we are not providing a very clear guideline around this. And again, manufacturers have been at loss for a long while. So I've struggled with this. I don't think we have hit on a perfect, if we had a consortium around, standards for masks for common use around the world, that would be phenomenal, but nothing like that exists. We have consortiums for healthcare workers, and it is true that the masks that healthcare workers wear cannot be used in a day-to-day life. So, this is one sliver of still an open challenge in my mind. I think what you ask, we have struggled with it, and I do find this value in what Vijay said, that we need to have digestion of this data at a local scale, because otherwise they will look like nice publications that have happened throughout, but I'm not sure they're having the kind of impact that we would like to have.
Thanks, Manu. I think that gives us something really to build towards. And I'd like to just ask Simon a little bit, again, focusing on data. But Wellcome has done a pretty incredible job in terms of emphasizing certain kinds of data-driven approaches that are data-driven for training, but also the building up of scientists that can handle complex data in Africa. That must have been quite a challenge. So would you like to tell us how you went about it? And if you were to repeat it, would you do it differently? You're on mute, Simon.
Yeah, I'm not quite sure how to answer your question because, again, I guess what I would say is that, we don't tend to sort of determine, the areas that people should be working in. I mean, if you look at the sort of the big programs we have, we provide support for, across, I guess, a range of disease areas. But if I take an example, in the Deltas program, of those 11 consortia, we have just one that's dealing with biostatistics. And that one has been developing sort of biostatistics masters across the continent. So I don't know I've got a lot to say on that, Jerry. I mean, Wellcome has been, as you know, very instrumental in and in fact, VJ has been probably one of the, global driving forces for open data. The African Academy of Sciences, who we work very closely with, have put in place their own open publishing platform. So I guess what I would say is that from the perspective of funder, it's providing big nudges to the research ecosystem without going into the granular detail of how that should be done. I know that's probably a short answer. It looks like I'm avoiding your question, but I think more it's about providing nudge to the ecosystem. And, VJ, and I've been reading the stuff that he's been publishing for India. It's incredibly controversial. And, it changes the sort of the funding and the business model for the major journals. But I guess what I would say at the level of actually sort of telling people how to do it, we leave that to the researchers to decide, sort of what to do and how to go about that. I don't know. There's probably not an answer to your question.
Well, the way I was thinking about it was the fact that for many things, particularly around support for clinical trials, for example, there are currently greater strengths in Africa in some regions than there are in India. And that's really been either a pull mechanism from research communities in Africa or something that has been pushed by funders. But it has built capacity, and it would be interesting to compare what the strengths are of the research ecosystems in Africa and in India, because in India, our basic science is very strong.
I'm so sorry. The problem.
Yeah. Now you're on mute again, Simon. I don't know whether that's intentional.
I'm so sorry about that. It was my phone was going and I was trying to stop it. It's embarrassing when there's several hundred people watching you sort of struggle with your phone at home. Look, I think, just to try and give a short answer to this, I think I would actually say that the major work, it's partly what Wellcome's done on clinical trials, but it's also been the work at the African Academy of Sciences. I think you're being quite complimentary about what's being done. I mean, the reality is that there's relatively little clinical trial capacity in Africa. We've done, and also Gates have done, quite a lot of work with both the African Academy of Sciences, but also with a consortium of about 7 pharma on a sort of, if you like, pre-competitive basis, who've been looking at how we can encourage more clinical trials in Africa. So I just say a little bit more about that. The AES has actually been putting together a sort of database which will provide information or qualitative information on where there is clinical trials capacity in Africa, with a view to encouraging more trials. So I'm not sure if you're right that there's more or less capacity in Africa to do that. But I think for us, it's been significant, the interest. You wouldn't be surprised that sort of pharma want to do that. But as I say, they have been very, very supportive.
Yeah.
And go on.
No, I think it is. Actually, I think trial capacity is better in Africa, and this is something that I do know a little bit about. for comparable populations. India and Africa have pretty similar levels of population. So in terms of academic clinical trials, it's different. I also think that the kind of capacity that has been built up for genomics is pretty incredible. So there are, I think, opportunities to learn for the many things that India has done well and the many things that Africa has done well. And maybe this is something that we should build towards, having recognized both similarities and in opportunities and challenges across the continent and the country.
Yeah, if I could just add to sort of, in a way, to answer the question that you haven't asked. I mean, what I would give you a glimpse of, and it's a very early glimpse, and I probably shouldn't even be saying this, but you'll know at the moment that there's a lot of very impressive demographic surveillance sites in a number of places in Africa. But what Wellcome and other funders are now encouraging, and I think this will happen probably within about 2 years, is really to look at what the big gap is for sort of longitudinal population cohorts. So I guess in some ways, maybe that's the sort of the answer I was struggling with earlier on, about how do you bring together the capacity you already have for demographic surveillance, the outputs of H3 Africa, which has been about sort of 10 years in building bioinformatics capacity, but how do you learn from what, the UK through Biobank, China, India, etc., have done with these very longitudinal population cohorts, which once established, then you can mine all sorts of data. So maybe that's the answer I was struggling for. And that's certainly the vision of, I'd say, Wellcome, NIH, Gates, and others. But crucially, will happen if there's African leadership and ownership of that. We can just provide the nudge.
Thank you, Simon. We have a number of questions from the audience, so perhaps we can take them in order. Some of them reflect what the panel has discussed so far. Others do not, but I think it's important to try and address them collectively. So I can read them out and leave it to you to choose who will address which ones. So the first one from Archana Deshmukh from Bangalore is, do Africa and India have enough health workers that can carry out immunizations? Are they paid enough and on time? Do we need a staffing plan? How can the two regions work together on this? Would digitization of records of health workers be helpful? So would anybody from the panel want to...
Yeah. I don't mind just diving to begin with. I mean, to be honest, I won't have any facts or figures, but what I would say is one's got to be incredibly careful when we use the word Africa. And I think the first thing I'd say is that from the perspective of my colleagues in Wellcome, we particularly pay attention to countries like Malawi, South Africa, Kenya, we have big programs. Honestly, we've been astonished and feel incredible humility when we see how well they have done. I think Africa CDC has done an amazing job. We've seen amazing repurposing of skills. Do they have enough health workers? No. Does the UK have enough health workers? No. But I think the response has been astonishing and humbled us all.
So we had John Nekisong on the previous panel, and it was a delight to hear him as always.
Yeah.
So I think, would you like to take up the idea of digital records helping us through the present and future?
Would I like to?
Anyone on the panel? Vijay?
The digital records are going to be very important in new ways, because the ability to generate them from voice to text, that is, I think, increasingly feasible, not only from voice in any language to text in that language, but soon will be feasible from voice in any language to text in any other language, and then back. This communication with the greater access of feature phones and smartphones is going to be transformative, both for looking at delivery of public health services and quantifying the outcomes and responsibilities in these areas independently. Ultimately, these kinds of health records also break away from the records being maintained only by the health system and the health workers and give ownership to those whose data is being recorded so that they are aware and it's portable and they can go with their records anywhere. India is already trying this out in its digital health mission, and that's rolled out a few months ago, August 15th, in our union territories. That combined with telemedicine and also the health records combined with telemedicine, but also on-site medicine will allow both high-end and routine access available hopefully to all in new ways. So, one is not overruling the importance of human contact in health decision-making, but a range of options with reach will be available as never before.
Thank you. Manu, could you take this question from Geetika from New Delhi? Can AI solutions in healthcare developed in India also be deployed in Africa? Can this be a potential area for collaboration?
Yeah, I think when I think about collaborations, one very natural way we are implementing this type of an approach has really been around malaria. Both pockets in India and pockets in Africa have challenges with malaria. And we have been rolling out a program around a network of robotic microscopes that are AI enabled, that do a lot of blood work in a completely computational way. And again, blood is the first place that you begin when you're starting to think about diagnosis. I think I would say it's fantastic to think about the capacity of AI-enabled solutions, and that capacity is growing very quickly. The challenge that I've seen in this space, which has been really important from medical solutions perspective, has been, do we have enough clinical data to train our machines on? And even just a simple blood smear, which we have looked at for the last 200 years, when I look at truly data coming from the field directly being accessible to innovators that are starting to build their models on, we've found a real lack of that. So the purpose of this sort of a program would really be is to make sure that this data is more broadly available. And then eventually, much of this will be portable. And I do see in a space like this, as long as we are careful and we're not over-promising, which is a huge issue in this field, I can see a careful step-by-step approach, but being driven by data and primarily making sure that the clinicians in the end have the capacity to make decisions of what goes through and what does not. Because I think the clinicians sometimes have gotten left out in these types of, once the data is out of their hands, a result comes out, but whether it's actually relevant or not. So I think I feel fairly strongly this would be a phenomenal portion for collaboration. We have been looking at it from a context of malaria, but you could ask the same question from a TB perspective. There's a tremendous opportunity, but I have not as yet seen a bottoms-up approach to this where the clinicians are in charge. And I think this would be a tremendous perspective to look into. And, I think, of course, from a training perspective, we are really building a lot of young people who are getting excited about AI. But we need to give them relevant problems. Otherwise, they'll be solving problems in advertisement of what movie we should all watch. I mean, it's unfortunate in many ways. And we have to really make sure that, as many folks involved in a clinical studies, that they are provided the kind of information to begin with.
Thanks, Manu.
Just to
Simon, go ahead.
Yeah, this is less a technical answer and more sort of a funding heads up. Some of you will know that the NIH has just launched I think it's about $60 million initiative to invest in data sciences in Africa with a number of different kind of calls. And it's something that sort of colleagues in India might just want to keep an eye on if that creates opportunities. And in fact, just today, and I'm just reminded of this now, and I should have thought of this before, there's a health data institute that's actually based in, well, I'm going to say based in my building, as though any of us have a building now. And they're actually just launching their own data initiative for Africa on a grand challenges style call with the Gates Foundation. And if people in the audience don't know, the way Grand Challenges tends to work is they'll start with relatively small grants, about $100,000, which are really designed to sort of search out great ideas. And I mean, India does have I think it's through BIRAC, isn't it? You do have Grand Challenges style funding. So it is also worth thinking about the type of funding that sort of seeks out and finds sort of, people with great ideas who might not have sort of a lot of backing behind them. So certainly from an Africa point of view, we're seeing a lot of money now going into catalyzing new initiatives in data sciences. And I don't know whether you have similar programs in India. Maybe I ask Vijay, so we turn this into a panel discussion.
Yeah, there are. Go ahead. Sorry. Go ahead, Karinda.
No, please go ahead.
No, there are many such programs, and I know that because coincidentally we were discussing that today. In addition to BIRAC, there is the Small Business Research Industry Collaboration Challenges, which have come up. The structure called the Atal Innovation Mission has put on challenges. There's a space collaboration for startups. So across multiple sectors, there have been grand challenges which solve problems at different levels. I just inaugurated one on agriculture today with a public organization and Cisco partnering. So there are many which have come up.
Sorry. Please go ahead, Simon.
Yeah, I have this great technique for avoiding questions by going onto the front foot. And I'm sure the audience doesn't mind. One of the things that just occurs to me, because we're talking about Africa and India, and this is a bit of an obsession of mine, is I wonder if it's correct to no longer talk about brain drain, which we all used to talk about, and whether we should be talking about brain circulation. So great minds go to the States or the UK or the other way around, or they go to India and come back. And I just wonder, in talking about Africa and India now, what we can be doing to encourage more mobility of talent between India and Africa. I mean, we played our own very, very small role in this, as you might remember, with the Africa-India Mobility Scheme. But to be honest, that was a drop in the ocean. But I just wonder what my other colleagues on the panel think about, should we stop talking about brain drain and talk about brain circulation? And I think this is relevant because we are talking about India, Africa.
So Manu and Vijay, would you like to comment?
I mean, I think that's a phenomenal point. And you could even ask that much more granularly as well in Africa itself. Africa is such a big place. It's just the fact that we use it as one word always gives me a challenge and a pause. Yeah. How much flux between countries. I think in a very small way, we've been thinking a little bit about this in terms of education programs. And one thing that often enough comes down is there is a phenomenal group of Africans that go and train outside and then are starting to both be engaged directly in their host institutions from the past. And I've noticed this very clearly, that at least in the young students that I see on a more regular basis, there is a very clear desire that even if they are going out to get trained for a certain amount of time, that they're building a bridge even during that time. So there are many organizations. CIFRO is one example that just came out of Ethiopia, which is Africans for Africa, primarily around bringing Ethiopian scientists from around the world to engage very directly with grassroots organizations. And I think the fact that Cypher was started by two young Ethiopians that are still in grad school gives me a lot of hope in thinking about that this is an issue that young people are starting to tackle, not just people at the end of their career. Then they say, oh, what can I now do in institution building? Because I found that fascinating, and it's more and more so. I think I don't have that much of a preview between direct flux between India and Africa, but I do find it valuable that could we enable young Africans and young Indians who are just starting their career to make sure that they are acting as a bridge, because they are highly networked and they have the pulse on the issues as well, but they are never given the keys to the house. They are never allowed to build institutions. And I mean, in a very small way, I do find that a very interesting approach at this point.
So, Vijay, I think Manu kind of covered that. So I will turn to another question from the audience, and that is from Gaurav Kumar from Jaipur. There's been a lot of innovation coming from the private sector in India in healthcare. How can Africa involve its private sector better in healthcare? And can Africa emulate India's health stack? So maybe again for some parts of the audience, if you could talk about the health stack as well, that would be helpful.
Thank you. The health stack, in a manner similar to the universal payment stack in India and now the agri stack, are structures which have been set up and promoted by the government, but they have inside them units which can have to obey certain boundary conditions about, in finance particularly, they are well laid out. Now they're laid out in health about what you can do and what you cannot do. But that allows others to come in and, be in the game. This has completely transformed the payment sector in India and is now transforming the health sector and will soon do so in the agri and the livestock sector. So this allows you as a customer to choose the best services, but there is a regulatory system which operates to make sure that the stack is not exploitative in any way, and it has to follow rules, monopolism, and so on and so forth. So this is something which is scaling up. Now, can this go across to other locations? And indeed, the payments stack has gone on globally, and India has been a good model for that. Now, the important challenge we have in dealing with capacity building or the ability to handle data or to use these kinds of tools, both in Africa and India, is in many ways, the group here, you, Gagandeep, Simon, and myself, Manu excluded, have a substantial 20th century worldview which we are trying to shed. And that is, funders, grants, build capacity, have training workshops, get it going, make sure it's done right. All that very, very important and critical, but not sufficient in a dramatically changing world. If we look at Africa and India's young demography, time is really of the essence. We are going to be in deep trouble if we don't scale capacity across all of the ability to handle science and data in every field. And that has to be done at warp speed. And it cannot be done top down by funding agencies, talented individuals doing some, all of that necessary, but not sufficient. These kinds of stacks, other kinds of tools which integrate and present to the user what you want, allows communities to take charge and drive their own agenda, basically have a churning of approaches, is something which will scale enormously. This has happened tremendously in India in the e-learning part. E-learning was put as a government top-down approach that you should learn in this way and so on. But the private sector has taken it up and run in enormous ways, in very asymmetrically negative ways in some cases. This is very positive ways in others. So therefore, the control and regulation of the stack in a light touch, efficient manner as necessary, but they can be truly transformative.
Thank you. We will move to another question from Arjun Preet in New Delhi. In Africa, so it's really about data, whether we can rely on the data that comes out of different places during the pandemic. And if we are to look at data and expect patterns that come from other parts of the world, what kinds of problems could we encounter and how could we fix them? It's a complicated question. None of you are epidemiologists, take a shot.
I just take a risk because I honestly don't think I can answer, because I think the easiest way is to look at, how, a reasonably sophisticated country like the UK has really struggled. And, we've found it really difficult to, in the era of COVID, to know how to count, for example, deaths. And I'm sure this is well reported, but, the lag times between the data. So I'm incredibly cautious about being critical of any African country, given the sort of the difficulties we've had with the UK in dealing with data. And I'm reasonably close to countries like, Malawi and Kenya. And we've got a good, in Malawi. The program that we speak to there is pretty confident about the data. But of course, there will be large sort of rural areas where it's very hard to know what's going on. All I will say is I want to give huge credit to the people that, we do work with and what they're trying to do in a very, very fast moving situation. So, I think we need to be skeptical about data, but at the same time respectful of the people working on it. Does that sound like I don't know if that's a reasonable response, but again, knowing how hard we found it in the UK.
Thank you, Simon. I think that's an excellent response. We come to another question. This is from Rajiv.
Hand up.
Oh,
sorry, Manu, go ahead.
Not completely unrelated, but I think before we run out of time and the clock runs out, I wanted to pose something to everybody, and I think just have you all reflect on the one thing that I've seen from a context of India and Africa and how fast changing technologies and solutions are coming on is, are we investing enough in the regulatory frameworks in the two countries that products that are designed for African population and Indian population by African and Indian innovators and international innovators, are we providing them enough support and training in how to build and design safe products and regulatory environment such that it is not just a wall that you face, but it's a learning curve? And I think, I'm speaking of this from direct experience of what we had for every country having to think about, okay, here's a solution. We're dealing with a pandemic. This is an emergency situation. Figuring out what regulatory frameworks are. So I just wanted people to comment. I've been on the other side of this and spoken to many African and Indian innovators at this time. And of course, international teams across the world. Often enough, we think about, let's go to the FDA. And if it's FDA approved, it must be good. And we go to the FDA and they say, unless you care about and are explicitly interested in launching this in the US, we should not be putting our time and effort. So I know many of you have thought about this. This might be a trick question, but I wanted to make sure that we touch upon this because it's incredibly important.
So I think
Gagandeep and Vijay, yes.
The idea of strengthening regulators, and especially regulators in low and middle income countries, is really, really important. And we have support systems from the WHO. We have regulatory groupings in Africa, especially, for example, for vaccines. We have AVRF. In India and the Southeast Asian region, we have the Southeast Asian Regulatory Network. These are mechanisms that were established, AVRF, more than 10 years ago, CIRN more recently. But these are mechanisms that we need to strengthen so that there is regulatory reliance. There isn't a need to repeat the same things. again and again in countries. But that requires a level of building up capacity in the regulatory system so that they become less risk averse. Right now, regulators want to protect themselves as much as they want to protect the populations that they are looking after. So I think you've touched on something that is really, really important, but we are pretty close to the end of our session. So just to summarize, I think when we talk about India and Africa, it's easy to say in many ways, but if you really look at Africa, it is very, very diverse. Not that India is not, but we need to recognize when we build relationships that it is not one entity that we are dealing with. What we've heard about is that a lot of things have happened in organic, unstructured mechanisms, but maybe there is an opportunity to be more intentional about this, to allow things to build from the ground up as well. But in terms of enabling mechanisms, including regulation, is there a way to think about continuing collaborations, strengthening collaborations between scientists, between industry? I think this can only be good for all of us. So thank you very much, Manu, Simon, Vijay, for joining the discussion. And thanks also to the Carnegie folks for handling this very well. To the few people whose questions we were not able to get to, deep apologies, and we hope we can connect offline. Thanks a lot.